and I will share my screen with you. Okay. So just to give a little bit of an overview of what we covered last week and the week previous, and just as a public service announcement, you should feel free to have your computers muted if you prefer, in case somebody shouts in the background or you want to blow your nose, as I did a moment ago, or you should feel free to have it unmuted if you want to ask questions, contribute, or answer questions as I pose them. Someone asking a question already? All right. So the rough overview of what we've done in the past couple of weeks, we began with an overview of the history of electricity, generally speaking, its discovery, its use, its purpose for humanity, and then its recent burst on the scene as something with extreme utility, not just something entertaining, fascinating, mysterious, inspiring, but something that can literally light up the world. Because, of course, when we think of electricity, one of the first things we think of is light. But that was not its use for the longest time. But then, as we mentioned, it threw a spanner into the legal works of Western cultures and Jewish culture, of course. We saw a couple of Supreme Court cases, and the first question we addressed in our series was the question of agency. If I press a button and a machine does something, is that me? And to cut a long share short, the conclusion we reached was essentially, in some cases we consider it you, in some cases we don't. We grant electricity human agency if you are being held culpable for something, breaking Shabbat, harming another person. But if there is a requirement for you to do something, invest a Torah with sanctity. We said to do shchita, if there are obligations on the human person to perform either an act of ritual or an investment of sanctity, we said electricity can't work on your behalf. That was class number one. Now, class number two, we covered a huge amount of ground, and I'm both excited and sorry to tell you we have a huge amount of ground to cover this evening as well, as hopefully we come to a close in terms of how we treat electricity today. Last time we got up to 2016, and we'll work our way from there. Now, a quick overview of last time. We said we need to define whether electricity without filament bulbs or electric stoves is a malacha, if it's prohibited. We said if you turn a light on and it's got a burning filament, that's ma'avir, that's igniting a fire. We said if you turn on an electric lawnmower and start cutting the lawn, it doesn't matter. That's not a question of electricity. That's a question of cutting grass, of harvesting, and other such malachot. So that's not the question. The question is, if I flip a switch and it turns on a fan going round is not a malacha. I can spin a fan with my hand if I want. So if electricity does it, there's no malacha there in and of itself. So the question is, if I flip a switch to do that, did I break Shabbat? And we said, what is the starting point for any question that we have ever, whether something is prohibited on Shabbat? What is the first question we have to ask?
Which malacha?
39.
39. Wonderful. And we began with a relatively thorough scan of the 39 malachot, the 4 different groups, which we suggested actually contribute to a hierarchy of human existence. The first group deal with making food. The second group deal with making clothing. The third group in red here or orange here deal with making shelter, with making hides, tents. And then the last group are more ephemeral, sophisticated, nuanced human behaviors that allow us to live in groups, in societies. And these structural activities that either give us the ability to make food or clothes or shelter or societies are precisely what we're not meant to be engaged in on Shabbat. We're meant to be at rest. As human beings, we're not meant to be contributing to our capacity to live. We are meant to be taking a spiritual or passive posture 1 out of every 7 days and focusing on our relationship with God. And every one of these 39 is a prohibited cluster of acts. So we began, which one could electricity be? And what were our first suggestions last week? I think Sol had the first suggestion, which was?
Mavir.
We had Mavir. As you see, literally ignited on your screen in pink right now. On the bottom left, you've got Mavir and Mechaber, which is to ignite and to extinguish. That was the first suggestion. We said the Aruch HaShulchan suggested that initially, but that was very quickly dismissed. Now, I mentioned in passing to begin with last week, the halachic system is lowercase c conservative by nature. If it's conservative by nature, things very rarely get overturned with any speed. So why did the Aruch HaShulchan's assumption that electricity is fire get overturned so quickly? What are your thoughts?
Because it's not.
Go on.
Ending of the technology.
The science moves quite quickly in the 20th century. 19th.
Excellent. Excellent. So for me, it's a amalgamation of three factors, one of which is precisely the one that you two just mentioned, which is the science changed, meaning the understanding of the science changed. Initially, they might have thought there was a spark running through the wires and that had been ignited. That very quickly was understood not to be the case. So the science shifted. Also, it was so early on, which is part of the same assumption. It was early on enough to make changes. Also, the people who made the changes and disagreed had enough authority to do that, broadly speaking. We're talking about Rav Grzinski, the Chazon Ish, and others who came along and said that's not the case. They had the power legally, halachically, to do that. And the third, and for me, this is a theme that will run throughout our discussion this evening, the most important consideration is the bottom line didn't change. Even though they said it's not Marvir, it's not Mechaber, they didn't make it mutter. They didn't say he's wrong, you can use electricity. He says he's categorized it wrong, but it's still a problem. So the halachic system can evolve quite swiftly if practice isn't affected. So that's the first thing. But Marvir Mechaber was dismissed. We then were left with Bona and Makeh B'Patish, which was whom? Who said Bona? Correct, the Chazon Ish, the man of vision. The Chazon Ish said Bona, and we'll come to that possibly a little later this evening. The Chazon Ish said every time you close a circuit, you are building, you are completing a structure. And that would be a problem. And as we've seen now, we've got Marvir, we've got Bona, Makeh B'Patish. Every one of the candidates for what electricity might be is in this last group, in the fourth tier of human activity. Now, did we say Bona stuck as an option?
No.
Correct. We did. We said it did not stick. There was a massive effort on the part of Rosh Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, a hugely influential halachist in the last century, but not that long ago. He passed away, if I'm not incorrect, in the 80s. He went through methodically through all the possibilities of what this might be, electricity in the malachic division, and he settled on it can't be Marvir, we all know that, and he said it can't be Bona, it can't be building, otherwise every time you close a door you're building, and it can't be Makeh B'Patish, otherwise every time you turn on a faucet you are doing Makeh B'Patish, so it can't be any of those. And where were we left? Which malacha did we settle on?
None.
Correct. We were left with the RCA's Journal of Jewish Thought. We were left essentially in the writings of Rosh Shlomo Zalman Auerbach with tradition, which when I was in Gush, one of the Rabbeim there gave it to me in this way. He said, this is the fiddler on the roof argument. Now, what's the fiddler on the roof argument?
Tradition.
Yeah, I was going to sing it for you, but I decided against it for all sorts of reasons. That this is what we've been doing. And to overturn it takes a huge, mammoth effort in terms of halachic energy to overturn social practice and permit something that's prohibited. And on the one hand, it can sound flippant or frivolous or flimsy to say this is just a tevya fiddler on the roof argument. But the truth is, it's a deeply important Jewish argument that speaks to a profound quality of Jewish life, because our community, as I said, in diaspora, is held together by nothing other than the fibers of tradition. And because we've all agreed in Orthodoxy to keep things as stable and consistent and unwavering and constant as possible and as uniform as possible, that's how we keep together. And we do that because we don't have an enforcement agency. We don't have an enforcement mechanism. We don't have a Sanhedrin to make decisions that if changes were made, factions would develop. Even in the United States, which has an enforcement mechanism known as the FBI and the military and the court system as local state police, even with all that, there are rumors all the time of secessionism. I remember back in my youth under President Obama, there was talk of some of the southern states seceding from the Union. I remember not so much in my youth. In 2016, when President Trump was elected, I think it was a piece in the New Republic where there was an argument made that there should be a blue state secession. And it was a long, detailed argument about how the blue states all pay for everything that happens in the red states, and they should just go out on their own and leave the red states on their own. Now, obviously, that was not a serious argument, but people were saying a lot of crazy things as history unfolded. But this country went to war over the need to keep together and not go off into factions. Of course, the Civil War was fought over a number of things when you train to become a citizen. One of the questions you have to prepare an answer to is, what was the Civil War fought over? One of which, of course, was slavery. And it also says economic reasons there, which is, of course, how it's taught in schools. But essentially, Lincoln is known for two things: for having freed the slaves and saving the Union. Keeping together is so important to keeping a culture on the same page. And in Jewish life, we don't have a Sanhedrin, we don't have an FBI, a halachic FBI, we don't have a halachic military. Of course, the reality on the ground in Israel raises questions, but halachically speaking, we don't have an enforcement. And to some degree, the success of orthodoxy in perpetuating itself where reform and conservatism has to some degree failed is because we have all agreed to keep on the same page as much as possible, so that you can go to a shul in Frankfurt, or you can go to a shul in Livorno, you can go to a shul in Jerusalem, you can go to a shul in Shanghai or in Sydney, and you can recognize the liturgy, you can recognize the room, you can participate and lead from the Amud, you can understand the culture, and that largely is a massive achievement in an age of factionalism and individualism and change, that we have essentially agreed that we will maintain Jewish identity in the diaspora by keeping the status quo as much as we can. Now, having said that, there is always a cost when you hold yourselves together. I remember when I'm talking of Gush, when I was in Gush, Rav Aaron Lichtenstein at one point was speaking about unnecessary chumras. And he once spoke at a plenary in Israel about engaging with the secular world, the Chilonim, and dealing with the Haredim. And he said that his son, Rav Lichtenstein's son, who is now a Rosh Yeshiva in Monsey, I think, Rav Yitzi Weiss, if I'm not mistaken, not Yitzi Weiss, forgive me, that's my father-in-law, Yitzi Lichtenstein, he's the Rosh Yeshiva in Monsey. He began to observe Chalav Yisrael in his late teenage years, which Rav Lichtenstein and his wife did not observe in their house. So they had a choice to make when he came home at 19 and said, I'm only drinking Chalav Yisrael. And what was their choice?
Buy Chalav Yisrael now or not.
Okay, buy Chalav Yisrael or not. That's always a choice. What was the choice turned into by their teenage son? Buy Chalav Yisrael or...
I'm leaving.
Right, or even if he's not, I'm leaving, I'm not eating with you, right? So Lichtenstein said, there are always things that we do as human beings, concessions that we make that we deem unnecessary in order to keep us together. And I had a choice. Do I believe I need to buy Chalav Yisrael? No. Do I want to have my son at the table? Yeah, so I'll buy it. So writ large as a community, there are things that we commit to and keep that theoretically we may deem unnecessary, but it holds us together, and that is a larger value that is lived every time that we hold on to universal practices. Now, if his son had come home and say, not only do I keep Chalav Yisrael, I'm only going to eat this one brand that's only available to be exported from this one country, and it's going to cost you $100 for each pint, you might say, okay, that's ridiculous. The cost of me keeping you in is overcome by, overrides the value of us staying together. So the question becomes, are there any figures who think that the fiddler on the roof argument about electricity, that's just what we've always done, don't mess with it, starts to bear a cost, even though it has the value of keeping us all on the same page? Now, I've expressed that in hyperbolic terms, and we will clarify this as we go through, but this begins with Rav Nachum Rabinovich, who I mentioned last time. And before we get into the details of his view, what I'll say at the outset so that we get a sense of structure is that we are going to see over the course of the next few minutes 3 central views on post-2016 electricity, each one of which is going to radically reform understanding of electricity that we left with last week. Again, last week we left with the picture that electricity is halakhically categorized as a rabbinic prohibition. There's no malacha involved. It's rabbinic. Which rabbinic prohibition? We're not really sure. Maybe it's molid, maybe it's minhag that's kind of evolved or hardened into a rabbinic prohibition in the view of Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, but that's its standard, which had implications. We said for Tzomet it had implications. It has implications for Choleh, for people who are unwell. If it's rabbinic, we know how to process that halachically. We're now going to see 3 views, which are all triggered by a response from Rav Rabinovich, which are going to, as I say, radically recalibrate how we see electricity. And how we finish after we see those 3 views, we will find out. But we begin with Rav Rabinovich. And this story began when one of his students, who was working with Tzomet, who we mentioned last week, wrote an article. And his article was dealing with security staff who are on security bases, on army bases. Now, if you're trying to get in and out of secure areas on army bases in Israel on Shabbat, or any day, the most proficient way to get in and out of secure areas is to have a key. Now, if you had a key for each gate that got you through a base, you would have a rather large key ring. I'm already feel quite encumbered by my key ring, and I've only got about 6 keys on it. And if you had to get through every single base, then it would just be impossible. So what do they usually use to get through secure areas?
Key card.
Excellent. Key cards, magnetic key cards that you tap on a detector and it lets you in. The same kind of card that many of us have probably used or seen used in hotels or in conference halls, where you try to get into a private room. They really don't give you a metal key anymore. Number one, they're much more expensive to replace. Number two, if you lose them, you probably have to redo the lock on the door. You get a key card, you can just change the magnetic code and you don't have to worry if it gets lost. And they do that anyway in between guests. So magnetic key cards are becoming nearly universal in hotels, probably apart from in Israel. So either way, so Rav Rabinovich student wrote to him saying, I've written this article about security staff on army bases on Shabbat, suggesting that maybe they don't need a Tzomet mechanism to use the key cards on the base, because they're security staff, which probably has components of pikuach nefesh on a broad scale. And electricity, we understand it to be durabanan, as we said last week, it's a rabbinic problem. And if it's a rabbinic problem, maybe we can be mekel to use these electronic key cards in security situations without turning to Tzomet. You don't need to install a grama magnetic clip on every gate. And Rav Rabinovich wrote back and essentially said, not only do I agree that in security bases and situations you can use a card, I think anyone can use it in a hotel. Boom, a bomb went off. Now, how did he get there? Let's have a look at what he's got to say as he literally opened the door to a new discussion about electricity. And he's going to say this in a few different phases. So let's begin. Bi'arti b'kama makamot. I have explained in a number of places shahadavar asur mishum uvdin dechol. That why is electricity prohibited on Shabbat? Because of uvdin dechol, which is a rabbinic category of weekday activities. This in and of itself is a complex sugya, a complex issue of law. What is a weekday activity? We mentioned last week that for a number of people, brushing teeth on Shabbos with the same toothbrush as you have during the week is classified as uvdin dechol. For many, it's not, but it's a kind of amorphous category, which is defined by Rav Moshe Feinstein and Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach slightly differently, but essentially means, is this an activity which is associated with weekday activity? And then if it is, we prohibit it on Shabbat under uvdin dechol. Now, he says that's what electricity is. It's a rabbinic prohibition. There's no malacha involved. Now, yesh la'amod al kach, we could probably presume, shebitchilat ha'himtzaot, at the beginning of electric reality, hachashmaliyut, hityachasu lekach, we related to electricity, sha'chashmal ozer la'adam, that electricity helped people la'asot malacha. 100 years ago, what was electricity used for? Primarily in the average household, what was electricity used for?
Lighting.
Yeah,
Lighting.
filament lighting. That was essentially it. What else? You didn't have electric contraptions all over the place. That's what, if you said electricity, the first thought somebody had, filament light, right? So you could be very worried in that circumstance, that if you say electricity is permitted, no one's thinking about, oh, maybe I'll go and buy that little fan that no one ever used before, the novelty item, and I'll use it. The majority item is turning on filament lights. So when electricity came on the scene, it made sense that you're worried of uvdin dechol. Baram, however, can you see my mouse, by the way?
Yes.
Okay, Bram. However, pituach mitkadem shel shimush b'chashmal. As electric appliances developed, hamtzi kelim chashmaliyim, electrical appliances came about, shetarmim, which contribute limnucha, to rest, va'af leta'anug shel adam, even to human enjoyment and pleasure, bli shahadam yifal klal, in a way that a person does not perform or commit, va'af lo na'asit bahem, and doesn't even result in malacha milamatet malachot. None of the 39 malachot are done. What kind of electrical appliances were developed that involve no malacha? I've said one already.
Fan.
Fan, right? Fans don't do malacha. If you have an AC unit, is there a malacha being done?
Nope.
Not really. What about the little lights?
No.
So we said those little lights, they're not filament lights, they're digital displays, they're LEDs. There's no malacha there. So he's saying electrical appliances came on the scene, and we could even argue, not only are they now on the scene, but if I were to grab a teenager on the street and say, when I say electrical appliance, what's the first thing that comes to mind? What do you imagine might be the first thing?
Television.
Phone, television, computer, almost anything before filament light. That's the last thing in our social reality that we associate with electricity. The other Rabbi, he says, and not only do these things contribute to rest and they don't really involve malacha, but quite the contrary, Shmirat Shabbat hafeicha liyot kala biyoter, it helps us keep Shabbat. Part of keeping Shabbat is being able to rest and learn and host. And if I don't have my AC unit on, or let's put it in the other way, when I've got my AC unit on, I can have a nice rest. I can close my eyes and sleep. I can read. I can learn. I can converse. I can host. Whereas if I don't have it on, Shabbos now becomes quite difficult. Perspiring on Shabbos might be a problem. Obviously not just sweating naturally, but building up a sweat is a problem. And every time I have to schlep around, I'm sweating from the heat. That makes it difficult. Putting a fan on. He's now saying, so we need to think about his basic opening volley. In his argument is, the science has not changed. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach understood electricity in the same way that we do. But what has changed is the application of electricity. Our social reality has shifted. Now, he then uses an example. I'm not going to read it inside. But the next 4 lines here, he says, Now, we have to remember, Rav Moshe Feinstein initially said that time switches on Shabbos should be prohibited. Having your lights on a time switch, Rav Moshe Feinstein said, Asur on Shabbos. How many people listened to him?
No.
Possibly his wife, but largely speaking, not very many people kept that. Now this, I'm going to say, is an incredibly important 5 words, which I think has an impact on Rav Rabinovic's argument, but not for him at this stage. He says, look, Rav Moshe Feinstein said time switches shouldn't work, and guess what? Ulam, you see my mouse again? However, Deazu, this view, lo nitkabla, it was not accepted. Puk chazi, and go and have a look. Shalom na'asar hashimush b'shan Shabbat, that no one is telling you that it's forbidden to use a time switch. You can go to the deepest, darkest parts of Williamsburg, and I don't mean dark in a pejorative sense, just they got a lot of black hats there. You go into the deepest, darkest parts of Williamsburg, no one's telling you it's also to use a time switch, right? Everybody does it. And again, I would just highlight at the back of your mind, remember it says, De'azu lonit kabla, this wasn't broadly accepted, as an argument to say that Rav Moshe Feinstein's psak fell away, it wasn't accepted. Vashimush bo, and using a time switch, lo rak shlo gram lepiritza, not only did it not breach Shabbat, o lezilut b'Shabbat, or it led to a degradation of Shabbat, that didn't happen. El aftram la'oneg Shabbat, it contributed to enjoying Shabbat. I didn't have to worry about the electricity bill going for 3 days Yom Tov. I didn't have to worry about, I can't have a guest sleep in this room because the light was on and I can't open up the guest bed. It goes on and off all the time. I don't even have to think about electricity on Shabbos because of it. I don't have to think about a whole slew of things on Shabbat. It helps me keep Shabbat. And this is his astonishing line. Me'ata. Having said that, number 1, that our social reality has shifted. Number 2, that electricity is only prohibited rabbinically because it is associated with weekday use. Now he says, Me'ata, as a result, Yesh livdok, we should search, Kol sug shel kli chashmali benifrad, each category of electrical appliance separately. We should think about dishwashers and air conditioning units and fans and electric heaters. We should think about all these different things on their own terms. V'livchon, and examine, ima shimush bo, if using it, davar sha'alul lavim lemlacha udam lemlacha, whether it might lead to a malacha, meaning turning on an LED light. Is that going to lead to malacha?
No,
No,
Say again?
no.
No.
shouldn't.
No, right? Meaning you turn it on. There's no possible malacha that arises out of that. If I turn on an electric lawnmower, might that lead to malacha?
Yep.
Yes.
Right, meaning I could turn it on over concrete, but I could then move it onto the grass. It could lead. Now, so that's first question we have to assess. Can this appliance lead to malacha? Number 1. Number 2, dome lemalacha. Is it similar to a malacha? Turning on an LED light in my ceiling, is that similar to a malacha?
Not really.
Okay, excellent. So we've got a little more hesitation. Why'd you say not really as opposed to no?
One may say you'd create light, which is fire.
Right, you could say, well, if I look at people's homes turning lights on and off, you could say maybe it's a filament light, right? Meaning it's dome malacha, meaning if filament bulbs come off the market and you know for a fact they don't exist, it might change the equation. But as it stands, putting on an LED bulb on my ceiling won't lead to malacha, but it might look like a malacha. And if you see people turning on and off, it could in theory lead to confusion. But he's saying those are the 2 questions we have to ask about every electrical appliance. And now he points out in this next passage, again, we're not going to read it all inside, but he says we also have to understand that we are living not only in a social change in terms of how we use electricity, but electrical appliances are changing radically. Let me ask you a question. How many times, this is my mobile phone, it is about 1.5 years old. How many times have I turned it off in the last 1.5 years, would you guess?
100 times
None.
a day.
None.
Yeah, none. I've never turned this off
None.
since I bought it.
Oh.
I've restarted it on occasion when it's had some issues, but I've never turned it off. And that's shocking to me. I remember when I first bought it, I had an alarm I set on it for the morning, and I wanted to know if I turn my phone off, is my alarm going to go in the morning? So I Googled it, of course, and I said, if I turn off my Samsung phone when my alarm go off in the morning, and the first response was, why would you turn it off? Which I thought, well, that obviously doesn't answer my question, but it introduced me to a new mode of thinking where objects are designed never to go on or off. Meaning you charge it, it's meant to kind of recharge and calm down. I don't go off, right? I sleep, but I don't go off. And please God, human beings can last for a long time. So machines, in theory, if they're calibrated internally well, should be designed never to go off. So number one, he says, things are designed differently. Actually, his Aleph here is they're designed that you don't touch it with your hands, right? It's just automatic. You go to a bathroom, you're going to wash your hands, you put your hands underneath. It turns on, you don't touch it. You go to a bathroom that's electric, what's it called? Sensor bathroom. You walk away and it flushes. You don't have to touch anything. That's not something people were imagining they were imagining it. That's not something people were dealing with 50 years ago. So the electrical reality has changed. Number one, you don't really have to touch it with your hands. Number two, they never go on or off. I never have to complete a circuit. If I pick this up on Shabbat and I start pressing all sorts of things, at no point would the Chazon Ish tell me I've done boner. The circuit was completed 1.5 years ago. So even if you want to tell me boner is the problem, this cannot possibly be the problem with me using my phone. So we're going to have to talk about something else. Number three, what's his number three? There are now things that are electrical in a way that we don't really identify that as their primary identity. This is how he suggests it. He says that when you go to wash your hands in an airport and the tap just goes on, you don't think about it as an electrical appliance, you just wash your hands. So electricity becomes almost tertiary to the identity of the object. So bearing those three things in mind, he says, Me'ata, im b'shimush b'machshir kazeh, if using this object, na'asit melacha melamatet melachot, we do one of the 39 melachot, baruch yesh la'asor, obviously it's prohibited. Va'af im yesh chashash sheyavo l'ta'ot la'asot b'melacha yesh la'asor, and if you're worried someone might make a mistake, you're turning lights on and off, they might think you can do that with a filament. Yes, I agree, you should prohibit. Amnam, however, im ein b'machshir shelefanenu, if with the object before us, there is no option, shel totza'at melachat melamatet melachot, that it is impossible that one of the 39 melachot could be done. I pick up this phone. None of the 39 melachot can be done with this phone. There's no boner. There's no makabah padish. I'm not changing any reality here. It's not getting hot. What could it possibly be? V'gam ein chashash she'avo l'ta'ot ben kula lahasig et totzah nasib machshir zeh v'im kula machshir achat totzah melacha. And no one thinks if I pick this up and start using it, maybe it looks like a malacha, maybe it might lead to a malacha. If none of those realities are the case, az ein la'asur, I'm going to say maybe, as opposed to one should not forbid it, but maybe we shouldn't prohibit use. Again, some of you may be thinking, this is radical, this is crazy, this is turning the tables. Life would radically change. If you're now telling me that if there's no biblical prohibition, no malacha being done, and it doesn't look like a malacha, and it can't lead to a malacha, there are some things that would be off the table, but a lot of things that would now just become part of Shabbat observance. Yes, some people are going to react that way. We'll see in a moment. But right now, so he asked the question when it comes to this magnetic key card going into hotels, as you see on the screen in the background. He says, is there a malacha involved in doing this? What's your answer? When I put that key card in and it unlocks the door, is there a malacha involved?
No.
No.
No. If I took my metal key and I put it in and I did exactly the same thing to the lock, there's no malacha. So it being done electrically, there's no malacha in and of itself as an activity. Number two, does it look like a malacha? Can you think of a malacha that it looks like?
No.
No.
Not really. So that's why he says, in this astonishing last line, using these key cards, opening and locking and closing doors on Shabbat, mutarim is permissible. Lo rak litzarchim bitroniim, not just for security purposes, elogam b'shimush ragil, for regular use. As I said, that caused quite a stir. And it caused quite a stir for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's a relatively radical argument. But number two, he is a significant scholar. He was, I should say, Zecher Livracha, a huge presence on the religious Zionist scene. He had written one of the major commentaries on Maimonides in the last 100 years. He was seen as a leading authority across the board, specifically on matters of science, in which his PhD was on. So this caused a bit of a stir. And I remember when I was back in Chicago, again, I say I remember like it was 14 decades ago, a couple of years ago, there was a fellow from Israel who'd come to visit, who now uses key cards in hotels on Shabbos because Rav Rabinovich was his rabbi. And he lived in the yeshuv in Ma'ale Adumim. It was Ma'ale Adumim, right, Jackie?
Yes.
He lived in Ma'ale Adumim, where Rav Rabinovich was seen as the authority of the town. So when he went to hotels, he used key cards. Now, as I said, whatever one thinks of the halachic argument, this is going to disrupt society on some level, right? Jewish society, I should say. We are no longer this coherent diaspora on one page. You're now going to have people using key cards, people not using key cards, people saying you're breaking Shabbos, people saying I can't eat your food, you can't come to my simcha anymore. And at some point, I guess if you take this argument, you're saying, yes, there is a value in us all being on the same page, but there is a cost to that. And now the cost of being on the same page is overshadowing that value. Because if we take the argument on its face here, life has changed so radically. And let's do a little thought experiment that 20 years ago would seem radical, but I imagine to many of you does not seem that fantastical. 20 years' time, how electrified do you think lives will be on planet Earth?
Rabbi Lerner,
Yes.
Rabbi Rabinovich is changing the flavor of Rabbi Moshe Feinstein's thing. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein wasn't just talking about that it was Dome Malacha or a type of Malacha. He also talked about Zilzul Shabbos. And Rabbi Rabinovich said, oh, it's not going to be Zilzul Shabbos. Yeah, it may be true for the key card, but that's not true about turning on your television or your radio or a lot of other things. That's a flavor of Zilzul Shabbos that you can't put your finger on. And Rabbi Rabinovich sort of bypassed that and focused on whether it looks like a malacha or leads to a malacha. That may be true for the key card. That's a good example for the key card. But that's not the flavor Rabbi Moshe Feinstein was against.
I think you are absolutely right. And the point he made about Moshe Feinstein was he thought it was Zilzul Shabbos, and look, it ended up not being. But you're right. Rav Rabinovich, part of the issue why this was so explosive was because it was so radical, but also because it kind of came out of left field and it wasn't comprehensive. Because he opened the door, as you see on the screen, to say, oh, look, we have to assess all these things. But then he only addressed one thing, which was the key card. So now all his Talmidim think, well, hold on, well, how do I know what Zilzul Shabbos is now? What about using my phone? What about using a now, you're right, it opens the question. And it would have been, to some degree, it would have settled a lot of these doubts had he have then come out with a compendium with a list saying television, Zilzul Shabbos, phone, not Zilzul Shabbos,
I remember him discussing with us in the yeshiva the issue of elevator when high risers and mid risers came in the Tel Aviv area. And there was a potential notion that religious people would not move in because on Shabbat they would have no way to go up and down. And he ruled on that. And he explicitly said that as long as it improves the ta'anug, the oneg of Shabbat, it's allowed. But if it's to do a malacha that you do during the week, like turning on a TV, he would not be part of that.
Oh, fascinating. Right. So, and I think though the critique I just gave, that this was not comprehensive, I think that it must have been intentional. He's making the point that I am not the authority on what Zilzul Shabbos is. I'm telling you the abstract theory that if it's Zilzul Shabbos, it's a problem. If it's not, and it contributes to Ta'anug, it's not a problem. And we as human beings like guidance. So I would like an authority to tell me, okay, so what can I do? I need help here. And I guess Rav Rabinovich's view was, I'm not going to satisfy your yearning for guidance. I've given you the outlines, and you need to either go to your local Orthodox leader who's going to take this and give you guidance, or you need to think. So let's just lay out, that's his view. It's controversial, it's disruptive, mainly because he is such a significant force halachically. And we'll come to in a minute. But there was a response from Rav Yaakov Ariel, who is again, in Israel, the flavor of what we call modern Orthodoxy is different. He is what we would call Dati Leumi, even though he's got a black hat, which instantly some may say, oh, he looks Haredi. In Israel, the flavors of social labels function differently. So he is an authoritative figure in what we would call the modern Zionist world. And his reaction to Rav Rabinovich, and evidence that he's part of the same world culturally, is that his response was published in the same journal, which some of the Haredim wouldn't be caught having their name attached to. So he wrote a response to Rav Rabinovich, who we'll come back to shortly. But his response was essentially, I'm not very happy with what you just did. Ratzidi laha'ir, and it starts with a little bit of surprise. I want to just observe ha'arai kranit b'davar hadiyun b'chashmal. I just need to say something important, he says, about this whole discussion, because hadan b'noseh b'kalot rosh, it seems to be that we're kind of dealing with this flippantly, ke'ilu gedolei poskim lo hitjachsu elav b'chumer, as if no one's ever spoken about it before. He essentially is saying, Rav Rabinovich, all due respect, you're speaking about electricity like it just came off the boat. The Chazon Ish spoke about electricity, Shlomo Zalman Auerbach spoke about electricity. You can't just come along and say it's uved in dechol, and we need to say maybe this, maybe that. So his first response is kind of instinctive, and what we'll see, the thrust of Rav Yaakov Ariel's response is primarily an emotive one, and will come when we get through all three views. Will categorize to some degree the kind of halachis in the same way, lahavdil, you have on the Supreme Court when they're interviewing nominees for the bench. They say, what is your legal posture? Are you an active jurist? Are you in favor of judicial activism? Are you a traditionalist? Are you a textualist? Are you did I say originalist already? They'll ask you these questions. So we could try to categorize the halachic posture taken by these figures. And we'll categorize that toward the conclusion of the three views. But now we have Rav Yaakov Ariel. He says, first point I'm making, this is not new. Electricity has been around, and we've had great people deal with it. So argument number one, what happened to precedent? What happened to great people speaking about this already? Number one. Number two, he says, HaTorah has kira mikol ha-malachot et ha'esh. The only malacha the Torah mentions is the malacha of esh. Even though it's a relatively light malacha. Why is it a light malacha?
It works in the background.
Yeah, you don't have to toil very much. And there's a whole description of why it is isolated as the one malacha that's described in the Torah. A number of the medieval commentators and Mefarshim say it's because you might have thought it's not a malacha. So the Torah wants to make it explicit because, plowing and schlepping and winnowing, you're really exerting yourself. A flame, you just strike a match or a stick and it's there. So the Torah mentions it. So it says Eish is specifically mentioned because it's so light. So, me'idach gisa, and despite the fact that it's such a seemingly light malacha, he avi avot hamalachot. It is the trigger of all malachot. And this is Rabbeinu Bechaya on why Eish is designated in the Torah, because without fire, you can't cook, you can't dye to make the colors strain, you can't build because you can't make tools, you can't weave because you can't make tools. Fire is the instigator of all work on Shabbat, even though in and of itself, it is a light activity. Which is his claim that others make. Actually, this is Rabbeinu Bachya as well. That's why we use a fire on Motzei Shabbos, to designate a new week, meaning now we can light fire. Shabbos is a fireless, flameless time. We resemble that with the Shabbos lights lit as Shabbat begins, and then we light Havdalah candle to signify the week has begun. And despite the fact that flames are relatively light in terms of exertion, and now this bit in red is what he's about to say about electricity, which is why I say the three views we're about to see all radically reform how we see electricity. This is him. Hachashmal, electricity. Gam kashe'ein bo havara v'lo malacha acheret. Even though you're right, it's not havara. And there is no malacha involved with electricity. He avi avot hamalachot. It is the, literally, grandfather of malachot, meaning it is the supreme dawn of what is prohibited on Shabbat. Im nezalzel be'isur hashimush b'chashmal. And if we start playing around and say, yeah, use the key card, use the elevator, use the phone, use the light, hashabat kula alula lehitchalel. The whole of Shabbos is going to be ripped apart. This is his essential argument. He then notes, again, it's a little out of context if you look at the original Ramban, Nachmanides, but he says the Ramban says trade is prohibited on Shabbat. I can't buy things from you on Shabbat. Which malacha it prohibits buying? Going to the store, buying and selling. Which malacha? Correct. There isn't one. It's a rabbinic prohibition, and he says, Nachmanides says, despite the fact that it's not a malacha, it is, he says, Ein lecha chilul gadol mizeh. You can't profane Shabbat any more than treating it as a day of commercial exchange, even though it's not a malacha. So the basic premise of Rav Yaakov Zariel's argument is, just because it's not a malacha does not mean it doesn't profane Shabbos. What do we call this colloquially when we speak to each other? Something might be a malacha, meaning something might not be a malacha, but it might break what?
Spirit of Shabbos.
Exactly. That's the colloquial phrase we use all the time. We say it's not really in the spirit of Shabbat, which sounds kind of amorphous and vague, but this is his primary argument. Shabbos will collapse. He says, and look at just this, you can again feel the emotive, instinctive reaction. Let's just think about connection for a moment. Her telephone, using your phone for social media. Her radio, using the radio to listen to the news. Her television, via internet. If you think for a moment, okay, so there's no boner, there's no havara, uvdin dechol, it's not going to lead to a malacha, it doesn't look like a malacha, so I'll just get out my phone. I'll make my phone calls, I'll check the news, I'll watch YouTube, and then this is his question, if we can all say you can do this, God forbid on Shabbat, Ana hainu magi'im, where will we be? And this is Baruch Hashem, thank God, shechanan et chachmei Yisrael b'chachma, that he endowed the Jews with wisdom, bina v'dat la'asorotam, with the recognition and the forethought to prohibit it. So his basic argument, and look at this, he says explicitly, Zod lafiyonati, this in my humble view is, hasiba, the reason, sha'chazon ish asor de chashmal mehatorah, why he said it's prohibited by the Torah, meaning Rav Ariel is saying, of course the chazon ish knew it wasn't really boner. He knows you can open and close doors, he knows all sorts of, he's not foolish. He prohibited it on Shabbos, pinning it on a malacha, even though Rav Ariel is saying deep down he thought it's not really the malacha, because it would profane Shabbos in its essence. It would shred our experience of serenity and rest and calm and sanctity and reflection. It would just shred the day. This is his argument. That's Rav Ariel, and I should add here, as a side, I'm sorry we've gone over time again. We've got a little bit ways to go. I'll try to keep it before 10, if not before. He also says, what about these instant hot compresses that involve you kind of, I'm sure many of you have seen these in hospitals or elsewhere. In Chicago in the winter, this was something people had often. You put them in your shoes and your gloves when you're walking around. You take these small packs and you kind of crack them, and then they heat up. And it's a chemical reaction. There's no bishul involved. It doesn't get hot enough that it burns you. Otherwise, you wouldn't put it inside your glove with your hands. But there's some technology here that's new. And in the Bohala Shel Torah, which is Rav Yaakov Ariel as well, he says, these should be prohibited on Shabbat. And he says here, Afal Pi, even though Ein Lanu Koach Ligzog Zeirot Chadashot, even though we don't have the power, we're not a Sanhedrin, we're not a Lahavdil Jewish Congress, we can't just legislate. I can't just make up Gzeirat. Mikol Makom, however, Mutelet Aleinu Achrayut, we have a responsibility. Lishmor et Chomat HaShabbat Leval Tifrot, to stand by the walls of Shabbos and stop them from being breached. And we have to think about something that appears novel, that is generating heat, something new. We have to misug zeh b'Shabbat kilu bichlal molid. We have to treat it like molid. Even though we can't make zeras, we can't say definitively it's molid. We have a responsibility as leaders of Jews in a diaspora where we don't have a legal enforcement system. We have to treat it this way. Otherwise, Shabbos will fall apart. And here he goes again in the same thing. V'Yisrael imlo neviim heim, b'nei neviim heim. And if Jews today are not prophets, we are the children of prophets. V'hachush habari shalahem, and the healthy sense that they have, Ya'id testified, he says, you ask somebody off the street, an observant Jew who's not necessarily a jurist, a halachist, who's not a scholar in a Sanhedrin or in a Beit Din, and you say, these hot packs on Shabbat, should they be asur or not? He's saying the instinct would be, yes, they should be prohibited, and he says that's a healthy instinct. And then listen to this, Kfar, and how already, Mimizrach Shemesh Ad Muvo'o, from east to west, Kiblu Aleihem Kol Beit Yisrael, the entire Jewish people have accepted. Limanem Palat Machshei Chashmal b'Shabbat, not to use electricity on Shabbat. And the same should apply to Inyan Sakit Chimum, to these hot packs. V'im Natiret Kol Elu Tipol Chamat HaShabbat Chalila. And if we permit it, the whole of Shabbos is going to fall apart. So, if we could summarize these two views, we've got Rav Rabinovich on the one hand and Rav Ariel. We have Rav Rabinovich, halachically speaking, being very, very traditional, maybe the wrong word. If I were to categorize him as a halachist, it would be that he's a legalist. He's saying, okay, what's prohibited on Shabbat? 39 malachot. It's not a malacha. There are rabbinic injunctions as well, like uvdin dechol. How does that function? If it looks like a malacha, or it might lead to a malacha. Okay, if it won't lead to a malacha and it doesn't look like a malacha, it should be good. Done. He's kind of a legalist, halachic mind who says, let's look at the text, let's look at the statutes, let's look at what's prohibited, and let's calculate the fallout. And Rav Ariel is more of a halachic culturalist, where he says, yes, you're right, there are 39 malachot, but there is a spirit, there is a culture that those malachot try to forge. And there may be something that doesn't fall neatly under the rubric of one of those 39 prohibitions, but it might just as well be, and it could shred the day. It could undermine all those 39. So here's this halachic culturalist that says halacha is not just a system of laws and statutes and regulations. It is a system that generates a culture. And that culture has a world of its own. You call it a meta-halachic system. A similar debate was had in a very different context, again in Gush, between two of the Rosh Yeshiva at the time, Rav Lichtenstein on the one hand and Rav Amital on the other. There was a case that kept being posed to them. You get stuck on a desert island, you and your friend, you can't find food. There's only two things you have in front of you, your friend or a pig. Which one should you eat first? And the answer was?
Pig. Pig, pig.
Yeah, you should eat your pig because your friend's still alive. Excellent, you caught my trap. Then, unfortunately, you're going through pigs because pikuach nefesh, and your friend doesn't make it. He gets infected, ill, something happens. Now you have pig and you have human. Which one do you eat first?
Become a vegetarian.
You go vegetarian. Yes, good option. So this debate was held between Rav Lichtenstein and Rav Amital because, strictly speaking, by the halachic letter of the law, it is a higher prohibition to eat pig. Called a lav, it's a negative prohibition for which one would get lashes. Eating human flesh is an isur aseh, prohibited by positive inference, which does not lead to lashes. So Rav Lichtenstein said, in his answer, he says, I hope I would have the halachic spiritual courage to follow the law and do what had to be done, despite how anathema it would be to my moral, emotional system, and I would eat my friend first. Immediately, everybody agreed never to go on holiday with Rav Lichtenstein. But putting that to the side, Rav Amital said, that's intolerable. All you have to do is to read the Chumash to understand that there is a meta-halachic principle at play that human beings are b'tselem Elokim, and it doesn't matter if Chazal computed that the Isser is an Isser Aseh with human beings and it's a love with pig. you eat pig, don't eat human beings. It's a similar argument that people make for the Maimonides, the Ramban, that he doesn't count living in Israel as a mitzvah. Why doesn't he count it among the 613? Some people say because it's not a mitzvah before Mashiach comes. The Megillat Esther says that. But some people say because it's meta halach, it's not one of the commandments. Without living in Israel, none of the commandments make sense. So of course it's not going to be counted as just one. So again, Rav Ariel is coming from a tradition of halachic thinking where there is a cultural meta-halachic spirit that is just as powerful. And to violate that is unthinkable, which is why you have this response to Rav Rabinovich. He just can't imagine what he's thinking. Now, we're not going to read again. There'll be a lot of text on the page. We're not going to read it all. Anyone recognize the face on the screen?
Rav Asher Weiss.
Excellent. This is Rav Asher Weiss. Rav Asher Weiss, I remember when I was in Israel for the year, most had not heard of him. I remember seeing one of my friends in the yeshiva had the Minchat Asher on the Parsha, had just really come out, the first volume, thought it was really interesting, had a look. And at the time, people said he's going to be one of the next Gedolim in Israel. And of course, we are now 10, 11 years since I left yeshiva, I guess. And he is one of the primary figures people turn to in Israel. And one of his great assets, of course, it's not for me to speak. He's one of the supreme halachic leaders. One of the great virtues of his position in culture is that the modern Orthodox see him as relevant to them too, because he made a conscious effort not to pin himself into a particular social group. So even though you may see he looks Haredi, so to speak, he was on all the phone calls with Rav Shechter and Rav Willig that were dealing with questions that we were facing over the last few months. He's one of the primary figures who deals with halachic issues in Israel. Also a great mind. You should feel free to purchase his Minchat Asher on Chumash, on Gemara. He's really a tremendous figure and also a very sympathetic human being just on a personal level. He was sent, again, because he's part of this world still, he was sent the responser, it seems, of Rav Rabinovich. He doesn't name names, but it sounds like that's what he was sent. And this is his initial response. He writes to Kavod Harav Hagav. So already you're beginning with respect. I'm writing to the great rabbi. I received what was sent to me. I do not agree with a single word that was written. In my humble view, a huge error has been made here, which will lead to horrific results. And there is a stumbling block to the masses, on a biblical prohibition. The will of God is at risk of being violated, is how he begins when he reads this. And in Jewish law, again, violating Shabbat and murdering the person next to you, though emotionally feel vested in different ways, and of course, in rabbinic thought, carry different weight, but legally, there is no distinction in the punishment between breaking Shabbat and killing your neighbor. And he is saying, what I've just read looks to me like massacres have just been permitted. Again, I'm engaging in hyperbole for the sake of making this clear, but he's saying biblical prohibitions might be at risk here. And this is what he said. It's more than 100 years since we've been dealing with electrical appliances and light. The great sages of the Jewish people have been dealing with, toying with, analyzing electricity in Jewish law. One said Marvir, one said Bona, one said Molid, one said Minag, one said this. And everybody came to the same bottom line conclusion, which was what? It's Asa. Whether it's Asa Minat Torah, Midrabanan, Minag, whatever it was, the bottom line practice is don't use electricity on Shabbos. V'ha'emet, and he says, yes, in truth, Yoredarko to Yesh Lepal Pelapak Pek B'chol Drachim, each and every one of Marvir and Molid and Makabe Padish and Bona and Minag, all those things. B'chol Drachim V'hasfarot, you can pick apart with logic an analysis, which was said, which is exactly what Shlomo Zalman Auerbach did. He said, none of these really work. You can do that. And now listen to his statement. Kol misha yirtze lahakel bazeh, but whoever wants to be lenient here, the ma'aseh in practice, hotzi atzmo min haklal. You have withdrawn yourself from the masses. And this is why I said this is a theme that's going to come up again and again. In a world without a Sanhedrin, holding ourselves together is not just a convenience, it's a value. It is a supreme value that keeps a halachic system living. And he's saying, if you start doing this and saying we don't have to worry about electricity, you're on your own. You're starting a new faction, because even the people who said Molid or Marvir or Bona, Makibah Patish or Minag, whatever they said, the bottom line is you go to a shul, you go to a home rather in Sydney or London or Paris or San Francisco or Venezuela, no one's using electricity on Shabbos. And if I go to visit your family for a vacation and they're putting lights on and off and they're sitting there with their phones, it will be unrecognizable. I will not experience Shabbos. Uke'ilu, and this is again an astonishing turn of phrase, it is as if, bat kol yatsa'a min hashamayim, a heavenly voice came out, sheyesh bazeh chashash malacha deoraita. There's something to worry about here. Now, of course, having the irony of saying it's as if a bat kol came out is, what's the irony of saying we have to do this because it's like a bat kol came out?
Because we say that a bat kol lo b'shamayim he.
Right, lo b'shamayim he, the sages use that example specifically and say we don't use a bat kol. But he's using a turn of phrase to say ke'ilu. It's as if a heavenly voice came out, because just look at what the sages are doing. Despite the fact that there's no malacha to pin electricity on, despite that, not a single rabbinic sage until this point, and this journal that I've read has said, go ahead and use it. So it's just as if a heavenly voice came out and everybody realized, I don't know how to pin this. I don't know if it's Molid. I don't know if it's Marva. I don't know what it is. I just know that it doesn't seem good. So he's saying the fact that people are reacting that way is indicative that there's a problem here, and you don't want to go away from the group. So what kind of halachist does he sound like? Does he sound like a legalist, or does he sound like a culturalist?
Culturalist.
He sounds like a culturalist. Having said that, he is conscientious not to be pinned that way, because he knows, or he feels, I'm not going to say he knows, he feels deep down from what he writes, halacha can't function like that. It does sound flimsy. If someone says, can I do this on Shabbat? And you say, it's not really in the spirit of Shabbos. People already hear that and they think, oh, here we go. The spirit, who decides what's the spirit of Shabbos? So he is now a blend of those two views. We're not going to read this chunk of text that I just put on your page, but I'll tell you what he says. He says that our fundamental premise with which we began last week and we began again this week is fundamentally wrong. I asked the question, how do I know if something is prohibited on Shabbat? And what was our answer? How do I know? What's my go-to? Lamatet malachot. I need to start looking through and saying, okay, when I turn on a switch, is it maraked? Am I sifting? Is it kosher? Am I tying? Is it mamachik? Am I smooth? I need to ask these questions. And we were dumbstruck because it didn't fit into anything. So we had to start grasping at straws. Maybe it's mavir. Maybe it's bonem. Maybe it's molid. Who knows? It's just minhag. We shouldn't do it. And Rav Asher Weiss says, maybe that's not how we answer the question as to whether something is asur on Shabbos. And he doesn't just pull this out of thin air. He bases it on the Gemara in the Yerushalmi. We're not going to read through a passage in the Jerusalem Talmud that's agadic in nature, that describes two sages sitting down and figuring out what's prohibited on Shabbat. And he says, when I want to know if something's prohibited on Shabbat, I don't ask myself 39 questions. Is it chorish? Is it zoreh? Is it kotze? Is it ma'amer? I don't ask it. I ask one question, if it's prohibited or not. And what's that one question? Does it have a high impact? That's the question. He phrases it differently. He says, does it have a chashivut and a tikkun and a chidush? I'm not sure how to translate that in a way that's accurate or to the spirit of what he's saying. But it means, is the act I'm about to do deemed socially, culturally, in reality, is it deemed to be an important thing that I just did? So if I walk into a room and I flip a switch, is that a maaseh chashuv? is that an important thing that I just did? Culturally speaking, would I interpret that as a significant act?
No.
No.
You would not interpret that as a significant act?
Yes, yes,
Yes. Yes or no?
yes,
It is a significant act.
it is.
Right. So, Rav Asher, you could have disagreed and I would have heard your argument. But yes, turning on a light in a room is a significant act. I didn't sweat from it. It's not an exertion, but it changes the room in a radical way. I could not see, and now I can see. That's a significant change. I turn a light on, it lights up a room. My answer to my question, is it prohibited on Shabbat? Yes. I've only got one question. Is it a significant act? And the answer is yes, it's prohibited. Then the next stage the rabbis engage on is, okay, how do we classify it for purely punitive purposes? I need to know which category of malacha it is to know that if I turned the light on and then I used my phone, are those two different malachot, in which case punishment and korbanot would pile up, or are they the same thing? It's only a technical need to categorize. And guess what? If turning on my light switch isn't choresh or zoreah or shochet or mavir, it doesn't fit into any of them, he says there is a catch-all malacha that is designed precisely for significant acts that don't seem to fit in with anything else. And which one is that?
Marker b'patish.
Excellent. Makeh b'patish. I don't know what this is. You've turned a light on. It's significant. It doesn't look like mavir. It doesn't look like shearing a sheep. It's not tearing. What is it? Let's call it makeh b'patish. It falls into that category. So what he has done, he has, again, radically redefined how we determine what's prohibited on Shabbat, but he's done so in a way that positions him theoretically as a blend of those two views, where on the one hand, he's a legalist. He's not willing just to say this violates the spirit of Shabbos and it's avi avot ha-malachot, and even though it's not really a malacha, it's the worst malacha, he's not willing to engage in that, but he feels that. He says it's like a bat kol came out. So how do I get to that point legally? You have to re-understand how we understand malacha on Shabbat. It's not which malacha is it, it's is this an impactful act? And if it is impactful, then I go to categorize. But that's really a secondary question. The main question when it comes to Shabbat, is it impactful? So there is one more thing to say about Rav Asher Weiss, because despite his innovation, and by the way, what's the bottom line for Rav Asher Weiss? Electricity on Shabbos, is it prohibited?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. Is it rabbinic or biblical?
Rabbinic.
Say again?
Biblical.
Biblical.
He just said it's a malacha of makeh b'patish. That means if somebody's sick, you don't have rabbinic loopholes. It's a biblical violation. So what we've got now is three radical different views. Rav Rabinovich, who says it's rabbinic, and there are all sorts of ways in which this is going to change over time. And again, if you imagine 20 years down the line from where we are technologically now, I'm imagining that my daughters are not going to be learning to drive a car. Why not?
It'll be driving itself.
Marvelous.
Yeah, no one's going to be driving cars in 20 years. Of course, it's possible technology moves slower than I imagined. But again, this was unimaginable 10 years ago, right? I remember when I had a BlackBerry a BlackBerry, sorry. I remember when I had a BlackBerry on my holster as the forefront of technology, and they're now somewhere out of use in a recycling pile, right? It was unimaginable. In 20 years' time, it could be no one's driving cars. They're just going around, and nobody owns cars. It could be that cities function with just moving vehicles all the time, like in Star Wars, obviously not floating 400 feet in the air, but they drive along, you hop in, you hop out. It's far more economical. You don't have to own, you don't have to maintain. You pay every time you get in, whatever it is. It could be that there will not be manual faucets. It could be there won't be manual toilets unless we have Borough Park, one factory, which specializes in manual faucets and toilets. At which point we risk becoming the Amish. We're just not engaging with society. So Rav Rabinovich says, you have to start thinking ahead. Electricity is rabbinic, and it plays out legally in this way. You had Rav Ariel, who said, put the legalistic jargon aside. This would shred Shabbat. Can you imagine people hopping in cars and using their phone? It's unimaginable. Rav Rabinovich might say, yes, it's unimaginable to you right now in 2016, 2020. in the year 2040, in the same way that time switches seemed radical and it seems perfectly normal now, 20 years time, hopping in one of the operational Ubers to get to shul may seem like not a violation of Shabbos. It might seem extremely peaceful. I get to shul, I'm not in a sweat, I get out my sefer, I'm ready for, meaning again, this is thinking ahead, different visions in imagination. And you've got Rav Asher Weiss, who says, not only am I going to you justify the spirit of Shabbos as inviolable, I'm going to tell you that it's not about the spirit of Shabbos. Halachically, I'm going to use legal jargon to push back on Rav Rabinovich's legalistic view and say that this is a malacha. It's biblical, the prohibition. How does this play out in 20 years' time? There's going to be significant differences in the way people behave. Now, before we get to the next stage, which is 10:01, forgive me, we'll do a couple more minutes. There is fallout. I don't mean fallout in a negative sense, though obviously the term does bring to mind nuclear, so we're going to maybe stop using the word fallout. But there are consequences to Rav Asher Weiss that actually go in a lenient direction. Again, his question is now not which malacha is violated, but is this a significant act? So let me ask you a question. I've got my phone on me. I do have my phone, sorry about that. I've got my phone on me. I tell you what, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to show you on the screen. There's a phone on me. At the top of your screen, on your phone, you have bars for reception, you have bars for Wi-Fi, battery levels up and down. When I move around my house, around the corner from here, these bars move a lot. Unfortunately, they move a lot in that direction when I'm in my house, but they move a lot. So let's say I'm an EMT, and I've got permission to use my phone. Can I just put it on my holster and walk around with it on Shabbos? Or do I have to have it plugged in essentially? Because every time I move, these are moving. And if electricity is now a biblical malacha, if these move, is it a malacha? And his answer is not even a smidge. Because he's saying, my question was, is this a significant act? And these bars moving about, it's not really detectable. It's not really significant. So it doesn't have to bother. He said, I've got a bunch of questions. There's somebody who wrote to him, was jailed in Israel for a crime, was released on parole with an electronic ankle monitor, right? Every time you move with an electronic ankle monitor, what happens?
You send motion.
It's detecting your motion. There are lights moving about. It's got your GPS being tracked by the police. Things are moving. So maybe when it comes to Shabbos, he should do as little moving as possible. And he says, not only do you have a heter because it's indirect and you've got a heter because you're going to shul, he says it's not a problem. It's just not even in the ballpark of malacha because it's not significant. Hearing aids. If you just said that electricity is a biblical prohibition, people have hearing aids that function on electric circuits. Is that a biblical? The whole thing was it's rabbinic and it's a heter for a choler. You're now telling me it's biblical. He's saying, no, it's not, because it's not the changes that are happening inside that, the little lights or the changes of current, that's not significant. I'd have to ask a simple question. Is this a significant act? And if it's not a problem. So we have consequences going in all sorts of directions. Who's holding the status quo? Essentially, Rav Ariel. Rav Ariel says nothing changes. I'm not letting you do all this cell phone reception bars. I'm not letting you use elevators. We just don't use electricity. That's the end of it. So we're left now, having gone through those views, we're left again at a crossroads where we have three different views. On the one hand, we have Rav Rabinovich. Again, our halachic legalist who says, it's uvdin dechol, there's no malacha involved. So we have to ask ourselves various statutory questions. Does it lead to malacha? Does it look like malacha? And if the answer to both those questions is no, I don't see why you shouldn't do it. And again, he understands his position on the stage and he doesn't say, I hereby endorse, do it. He says, Lefiani adati, in my humble view, I don't see why we should prohibit it. So that's one view, and I would say it's incidental that that's on the left. but that's one avenue we could go down. We have the centrists, and one's green, you should notice in the background, the other's yellow, and we'll have red in a minute. But we have Rav Ariel in the middle who's saying we need to hold the ground. This is going to shred what Shabbat looks like. Culture will change. It won't feel the same. And we have the Minchas Asher, again, who is this blend of a culturalist and a legalist who says, I'm going to use legal formula to come to my position, but it is informed by the fact that for 100 years, this has been the view of sages, independent of what they thought the problem was, they think it's a problem. Now, again, if we were living in an age, which please God, we will, when we have a Sanhedrin, you can imagine the Lishkat Hagazit, the court of hewn stone where the Sanhedrin sits, great minds like this sitting around debating the issues, hearing the arguments. You can imagine the press waiting outside. Are we going to get a 2-1 decision? Are we going to get a 3-0 decision? Where is this going to fall? Which will ripple through Jewish culture and society with an enforcement mechanism. So if Rav Rabinovich claims win the day and the others concede, you know what, you've got an argument, and you know what? We can make mass change on a mass scale. As an example, again, lahavdil, last week when the Supreme Court made a decision discriminating, firing somebody for being gay is a federal crime, you can't, any state in the country is now by definition under duty to keep that law. And if somebody breaks that law anywhere in this country, they go to jail. So they've got an instantaneous capacity to make radical change without making factions. We don't have that capacity. We need to, as a people, hold to consensus as much as we can until we get an age when we can make radical shifts if they are deemed by the Sanhedrin to be in the spirit of law. And again, we're not talking about changing biblical law. We're talking about rabbinic enactments. We're talking about new technology, how to classify it. They can have an argument. And it would be a fascinating way to do it. Again, if the argument on the part of Rav Ariel and Rav Asher Weiss is motivated by the concern that this is going to make you different, it's going to divvy up the Jewish people, that would be mitigated in a major way if we had an enforcement mechanism. But that's not our situation right now, so we have to go for consensus. What is the consensus today? The consensus today, if I were to ask you who are the Gedolim in America, in the modern Orthodox world, who are the great leaders? I would ask you to contribute names as well. I can only speak from my experience. The last few months have been edifying very much as well. Who were people asking COVID questions to? Who was getting calls about sharing ventilators? Who was getting calls about making calls on Shabbat? Who was getting calls about how to daven and how to lane and what to do? That's a good way to figure out who the Gedolim are, who's getting and answering these questions. And in America, in the circles in which we travel, those questions were going to essentially two people, Rav Shachta and Rav Willig. Yeah. And this is Rav Yonah Rees. He's the Av based in Chicago. He was dean of the Reitz Theological Seminary, which is the yeshiva at YU. Rabbi Penna is currently in that position. He was the predecessor to Rav Penna. And this figure at the bottom is Rav Yatz, Rav Yosef Tzvi Rimon, who I've mentioned on occasion, who's an up-and-coming posek in Israel in the modern Orthodox Dati Leumi community. But we have here a good range of who the Gedolim are. And again, we'll leave for another time. You may notice the Gedolim all have beards, which tells you something very important. What does it tell you?
Hair is
Nothing.
Well, it tells you they're all men, which is, I think, something important, which again, that we can have discussion another time. The Supreme Court in the United States, the Havdil, is not all men. And it so happens, I don't think any of them have beards. Maybe Thomas Clarence has a little beard, like a Rav Shechter kind of beard, I can't remember. Either way. Yeah, if we were to assemble the consensus of views, we are kind of headed in the middle here. We have Rav Weiss on the one, and again, Rav Weiss, we didn't read it inside, but he finishes his piece saying, I am not telling anybody to do anything. I'm not insisting that this is the halacha. I'm telling you this is my view. And in his words, we can actually go back just to his final word. He says, Eineni omer kablu dati. I'm not telling you to accept my view. Hadavar masur. This matter is handed lehechratam shel gedolei hora'ah einei ha'adam. I hand this over to the great teachers, the eyes of the generation, Hamorim derech u'me'irim netivot, who light the way and lead the path. Now, who is that? If it's not him, I don't know who he's talking about. So again, that's the kind of signature humility you get from our supreme justices, so to speak. In an age without a Sanhedrin, everybody knows that we are in an incredibly fragile position where we have to tread very carefully if we want to maintain a coherent community. So if we go with consensus, I'll give you the bottom line. Consensus in terms of how these things are computed essentially is with Rav Ariel in the middle. Everybody seems to agree. So we're kind of left where we were at the end of last week. This whole abstract exercise was vitally important, number one, to expose us to the workings of how halacha works, develops, and responds. It's also important because, again, my instinct is, if life does change radically in the next 3 decades in a way that it is impossible to really engage with modern life without having electrified homes in every way, this may come into play in the same way that Rav Moshe Feinstein's initial "this is terrible" time switch view kind of ameliorated over time. Maybe that'll happen bearing in mind some of this discussion, but as it stands today, everybody who is asked these questions, Rav Shechter, Rav Willig, and Rav Rees, who kind of follows them, Rav Yatzer, they all say electricity is prohibited rabbinically, but the spirit question is pretty important. And this came to be manifest very strikingly in the last couple of months over one particular issue, which is the Zoom Seder. There was a lot of talk about, can we do Seder over Zoom? We're going to be isolated. We want to be with our families. There are some people who are going to be stuck alone in their own home. Can we do a Zoom Seder? And what was the bottom line that most people were given?
No.
No, we can't do it. Now, screens may be a little more complicated depending on the screen, again, because of questions of ketiva and where the ink is moving around. But putting aside that, if we assume the only issue is electricity, the lights on the screen are not filament, it's not getting hot, touch the screen. If it's not a touch screen and it won't disrupt it, it's not hot. The only question is electricity. If we said electricity is midrabanan, it's rabbinic, and you've got a chola, or you're doing it with a shinui, in an unusual way. There are all sorts of loopholes in theory one could make. And many of you may have seen that a group of Moroccan rabbis in Israel, Moroccan halachis, came out with the tshuva saying you can do a Zoom Seder, which led to a massive onslaught of pushback from every other rabbinic group in the Orthodox world saying, no, you can't, no, you can't, no, you can't, no, you can't, no, you can't. At which point a couple of the rabbis who had signed on to the psak from the Moroccan rabbi saying you can, withdrew their support, saying in the spirit of keeping together precisely what we've just discussed, in the spirit of staying on the same page, I'm going to withdraw support and tell people not to do this. We're not going to read this all, but this is a worthwhile article to see where Chaim Seiman, who is a legal scholar but a sociologist of halakha as well, he essentially says, we'll read the bottom line here, and I see it's 10:15, so we're going to have to wrap up. There's a lot still left to say. I guess we'll touch on some of it next week. He essentially says here at the bottom, we're not going to do just the bottom. We're going to read 2 paragraphs because to finish, this is how we'll finish. And next week we will begin where we left off, but I want to finish in a neat way. So I'm going to read what he says here. The Mishnah enumerates 39 basic categories of labor forbidden on the Sabbath. In the past few generations, however, they have become increasingly removed from daily experience. As a lived practice for most observant Jews, the prohibitions of Shabbat boil down to, no pun intended, refraining from driving, cooking, and the use of electronic devices. That is what it means for most of us to keep Shabbat today. Not many of us put our plows away. Not many of us put our winnowing schedule on hold. We tend to say, okay, I can't cook. I'm going to put out the blech or the hot plate or the plate or whatever I put out. I'm not going to drive. And I'm not going to use my phone or turn lights on and off or use the microwave's cooking. I'm not going to, that's basically what Shabbat boils down to for most of us. Maybe those who take notes or write a diary entry don't write. But essentially, that's what Shabbat boils down to. No one is shechting out there on a daily basis other than shochtim. So he says, More than any other object, the screen has become the totemic signifier of our inescapably digital modern lives. Our work week, our obligations, our deadlines, and our modern stresses are all mediated by the screen through which we access news, politics, and business. The secular and profane, this barely three-dimensional portal draws us away from our immediate familiar and spiritual setting into the vast expanse of the human universe. Few objects draw greater contrast to the Torah's concept of Shabbaton, cessation, that Sabbath and holidays aim to impart. In short, this line, the screen represents, not is, but represents all that is prohibited on Shabbat. Instinctively, from our gut, emotively, culturally, using a screen on Shabbat seems to fly in the face of the entire project of what Shabbat aims to achieve. We are engaging with news, politics, deadlines, work, messages, mail, in a way that would, in Rav Ariel's spirit, shred the day. Thus, for most Orthodox rabbis and their communities, the image of a Seder night centered on a table graced with matzah, bitter herbs, charoset, the Haggadah, wine, and a computer screen was simply too jarring and discordant to contemplate even in these dire times. Traditionalist rabbis have adopted all manners of leniencies to ameliorate the suffering and isolation caused by the coronavirus. And I should say, rabbis were told, and I put out in that piece before Pesach that we sent out, if you know somebody who is lonely to a point where it might be a concern to their lives, pick up a phone and call. I know off book, there were more leniencies taken in individual cases where it was deemed necessary. But broadly speaking, on a social level, the fabric of Shabbat was threatened in a way that in rejecting the Zoom Seder, they sought to protect people from the vertiginous speed of modern life itself, and one need not be halachically observant to appreciate this protection. That's his bottom line for the Zoom Seder. That will be our bottom line for tonight. Because it's late and I don't want to keep you beyond time, and we'll finish off next week. So the bottom line, where we finish this week is essentially where we finished last week for now. So all that's changed in the last, apologies, hour and 25 minutes is that there is now more information to compute where things may shift over time. Maybe it will deepen our yearning for a Sanhedrin to return, not because we favor one view over the other, but because we have a yearning to see this come to life. Again, when we say Hashiva Shoftenu Kavarishona in the Amidah 3 times a day, bring back our judges like there were, it's not just because we like the view of judges, but because the system came to life in a way that is inspiring. I can't help but feel I feel energized when I see a nomination to the Supreme Court, when I see rulings coming out, and I'm sure we'll have a bunch of rulings this week from the Supreme Court. It's evidence of a system that's alive, and the American system is so similar, lahavdil, to the Jewish system in the sense that you have a written text. In England, you don't have a written constitution. Most of the time, they're just making it up and look to the guy next to them and say, do you remember what we did last time? That's what happened when it came to the heir to the throne. They had to change the rules so that they could have a female heir to the throne if Kate and William's first child was a girl. But there was no written law that said yes or no. They just looked around and go to historians and say, well, what's the common law? So in America, you have a text, you're interpreting. I was fascinated last week, Neil Gorsuch, the conservative nominee of President Trump, who wrote the opinion that you can't discriminate against homosexuals and fire them on that basis. The reasoning behind that was fascinating to me. It was all based on the law. Again, it was not a constitutional question, it was a legal question because it was dependent on a statute legislated by Congress that said you cannot discriminate based on sex. Gorsuch is a textualist. He says, I'm looking at what the text says. The text says you can't discriminate based on sex. Now, if I fire somebody because they're gay, did I discriminate based on sex? What do you think? I'm not asking you to dive in culturally. I'm asking based on the text. If it says you can't discriminate based on sex and I fire someone because they're gay, did you discriminate based on sex?
No.
No.
Okay, so I didn't hear any yeses. I saw some nods from people who were muted, so I'll say you've got both answers. And it's there you go, we got a yes. It's complicated because when it comes, I'll tell you why it's quite compelling what Neil Gorsuch said. You could say, well, I'm not discriminating based on sex. You being gay, sex means that you're male or female. And this also protects the word transsexual, is that the word I'm looking for?
Transgender.
Transgender.
Thank you. It also protects transgender who say, I am a female, even though my biology is male. And people say this is such a flimsy argument. In fact, one of the other Supreme Justices says, this is a pirate ship. This is a textualist argument flagged up underneath judicial activism. Because there's no way that when Congress in 1970 wrote the law that said you cannot discriminate based on sex, they meant in that text that you cannot discriminate somebody who says they're one sex, that biologically they're not. But that was not Neil Gorsuch's argument. This was his argument. And again, this is what got me thinking. He said, somebody who's gay, you are firing a man, let's say, because what? Because what's the quality in him that you don't like?
Sexual orientation.
It's female quality.
So, well, if somebody's gay, what is it you don't like? No, the sexual orientation is the term. You don't like that they love men, right?
Or women.
Say that again. If it's a woman, let's say just for the case of simplicity, it's a man. You fire a gay man and you say you are fired because you're gay, meaning you love men. Let me ask you a question. If that person in question was a woman, would them loving men be a problem?
No.
No. So you have just discriminated on the basis of sex. The fact that he's the man is what was your problem, meaning you didn't like him loving a man would not have been a problem if it was a woman. So you discriminated on the basis of sex. That was Neil Gorsuch's argument. It's in the weeds and it's complicated, but that's how he defended it and saying, look, I'm not advocating a liberal agenda. I'm looking at the text. And when you say I fire you because you love men, your problem is that he's a man loving men. If he was a woman loving men, you wouldn't have a problem. So you discriminated on the basis of sex. Either way, that was something I've been wanting to mention to someone, but haven't seen anybody other than Miriam, and she doesn't like it when I come home and talk about Supreme Court decisions. So thank you for bearing with me for that. The point I was making, largely speaking, lahavdil, is how a living judiciary makes society function. And guess what? If you don't like the law that they determine in court, it doesn't affect legality. You have to keep the law. But how does the law change? You build activist groups. You try to make a case in public. Maybe you have some written protest. You write pieces in the art. You advocate your position. You hope when there's a new justice nominated to the court, they hear your view. They listen to your arguments. That's how it works. And if we had, lahavdil, again, if we had a Sanhedrin and they determined the question of electricity and they fell down on the side of Rav Asher Weiss, that means for now, that's the halacha law of the land. Again, this is not biblical law. That's another discussion. But if this is a new technology we're trying to address, you don't like the fallout, that doesn't mean you walk away. You can't go to your local rabbi and say, can I please use electricity on Shabbos? That would be nonsensical. We live in a Jewish state. And we'd have to abide by the law, and we'd have to build advocacy groups, and we'd have to write papers, and we'd have to make arguments, and we'd have to build a public consensus, which builds us as a people around cultural questions, which is why, for me, America is a far more exciting place to be, despite what seems like the chaos of the last months. In England, you don't have these debates because you don't have a constitution. A lot of these questions have been settled. You're kind of drawn into history. Some of you may have seen today, the Museum of Natural History's decision. People get together, they talk about things as a culture. That is what I yearn for. In an age of messianic Sanhedrin, we come together and we talk about cultural issues and we respect our Supreme Court justices, and these issues get sorted out. As I say, if it deepens our yearning, all the better. As it stands right now, I'm in no position to disagree or endorse one or the other. Right now, the consensus view is electricity is a rabbinic problem. The things we did not address, which we'll address next time, which are what about Alexa? Okay, let's say electricity is a rabbinic problem. What about if I speak? I don't press anything. I don't touch anything. What if I speak? There's a question about that. What if I live in Israel and there are Jews working in the electricity generator? Not in the generator, in the...
All right, well, I'm listening to this. That happens to be very interesting, okay? Is that okay?
So we'll, that's excellent feedback to get. So we will work on those next week, and then we'll go ahead with our third portion, which will be a question of simulation. When we need to have flames, can electricity replace flame? When I need to have daylight, which is occasionally halachically required, can electricity generate that? When I need to have connection, which of course we are all feeling over the last 3 months, whether it's minyan or saying Birchat HaGomel or visiting the sick or Nicham Avelim, can electricity simulate connection? Those are going to be our questions, separate from the Shabbat question, which we'll end off with, which we'll finish off next time. In the meantime, I'll see you all for Shachris in about 10 minutes. And I wish you all a very, very good night. I will stop the recording. I'm not going anywhere for the next few minutes if anyone's got any questions.